이번에는 미국의 비영리 또 기부법 제도에 대해서 전반적인 이해를 갖는 시간을 갖도록 해보겠습니다. 두 번째 연자이신 심혜진 변호사님 모시겠습니다. 뜨거운 박수로 부탁드립니다. 네, 심혜진 변호사님은 미국의 비영리 전문 변호사이시고요. 현재 여러 비영리 단체들의 이사회에 참여하고 계십니다.
안녕하세요. 심혜진 변호사입니다. 비영리계를 대표하는 많은 분들과 또 뛰어난 강사분들과 함께하게 되어서 영광으로 생각합니다. 이 컨퍼런스를 주최해 주신 한국 NPO 공동회의와 국제기부문화선진화 포럼, 그리고 보건복지부, 그리고 후원해 주신 행정자치부, 한국비영리학회, 그리고 한국공인회계사회에 특별히 감사의 말씀을 전합니다. 대한민국을 사랑하는 대한의 딸로서 대한민국의 비영리계가 도약하는 이 시점에 함께 되어 매우 기쁩니다. 저는 미국에서 수년 동안 비영리 단체를 대변하는 변호사로 또한 비영리 단체들을 대표하는 리더로 활동하고 있습니다. 제가 대변하는 단체 몇을 소개하자면 IT와 인도 등의 학교를 세우고 빈민을 돕는 국제구호단체, 제3세계에서 노예나 인신매매된 아이들과 여자들을 구출하고 법정에서 변호하는 국제구호 법률단체, 미국 전역에서 어린이 과학도들의 과학 경연을 통해 로봇 연구를 발전시키는 교육단체, 세계 대도시에서 미술 전시회를 열어서 예술을 발전시키는 단체, 뉴욕에서 비혜택자들과 전과자들에게 법률 서비스를 제공하는 변호사 단체, 아프리카의 우물을 파주고 전기공사를 해주는 선교단체, 지역 종교단체, 뉴욕의 노숙자들에게 음식을 제공하고 검정고시 공부를 시켜주는 도시구호단체, 그리고 세계 곳곳의 신인 피아니스트의 발굴과 음악회 제공, 그리고 마스터 수업 등을 통해서 클래식 음악을 대중화하는 음악단체 등 매우 다양합니다. 그 경험들을 통해 비영리계가 나라의 경제, 국민의 복지, 그리고 세계에 끼치는 매우 긍정적인 영향을 믿게 되었습니다. 제가 소개하고자 하는 미국 비영리법 체제는 비영리계의 투명성과 책임, 그리고 영향력을 촉진하는 큰 역할을 하고 있습니다. 물론 미국의 법체제는 결코 완벽하지 않습니다. 저는 미국에서 활동하는 변호사로서 그것을 매일 체험합니다. 하지만 여전히 미국의 비영리 관련법과 법체제는 미국의 비영리계를 발전시키는 데 큰 역할을 하고 있습니다. 오늘과 내일의 컨퍼런스를 통해서 대한민국의 비영리계가 더욱 발전할 수 있는 기회가 되기를 바랍니다. 저는 오늘 기조강연을 통해서 미국 비영리 기관의 입법 역사, 비영리 기관이 국내 경제에 미치는 영향, 전체적인 비영리 관련 법률 체계, 비영리 기관의 종류와 법적 자격, 비영리 기관과 국세청의 관계, 비영리 기관과 주정부 법무장관 간의 관계, 그리고 비영리 영역이 발전하는데 비영리 관련법이 어떻게 도움을 주고 있는지를 설명할 것입니다. 내일 세션 프레젠테이션을 통해서는 비영리 법인의 유형, 비영리 법인 설립 인가 과정, 선량한 관리자로서의 이사회의 의무, 오랜 비영리 역사를 통해 배운 비영리 운영 모범 사례, 법인 해체 과정, 면세 법인의 유형, 세금 면제 신청 과정, 그리고 대중과 자선단체, 단체의 이사, 국세청, 그리고 법무장관 간의 서로에게 주는 혜택과 규제 관계에 대해서 자세히 설명하겠습니다. 법률적인 내용이 정확히 전달되기 위해 또한 다른 강사분들을 위해서 제 강연을 영어로 해달라는 주최 측의 요청을 받았으므로 이해해 주시기 바랍니다. In the United States of America, the history of organizations based on volunteer work and supported by private foundations began as early as the 18th century. These early nonprofit organizations were usually founded by churches and other religious organizations and for the primary purposes of establishing educational institutions, hospitals, fire departments, and orphanages. Early nonprofit organizations operated with little, very little, government regulations or benefits. However, beginning in the late 19th century, federal and state governments became involved in the establishment and regulation of nonprofits. One of the earliest federal laws relating to nonprofits is the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act of 1894, which provided tax-exempt status to certain nonprofits. over the 75-year period between 1894 and 1969, U.S. Congress established the basic principles and requirements of tax exemption, identified business activities of tax-exempt organizations that were subject to taxation, and defined and regulated private foundations as a subset of tax-exempt organization. In the 21st century, nonprofit organizations are involved in a wide range of activities that intersect with the business community, the national economy, and social welfare. For example, social enterprise organizations are formed to achieve its primary social and environmental mission using business model. Recycle Force is an example of tax-exempt organization, and its mission is to become the most comprehensive recycling hub in its own state and to help those returning from prison gain immediate and legitimate earnings, thereby affecting the business community. The National Bureau of Economic Research is a nonprofit organization that conducts various economic researches which are used for for-profit companies to expand the economy. And of course, the American Red Cross provides social and relief services affecting the welfare of the people. According to the National Center for Charitable Statistics, as of September 2015, there are over 1.5 million tax-exempt organizations in the United States. Among them, public charities are over 1 million, which is approximately 70% of all tax-exempt organizations. For this reason, I'll focus on public charities later on. New York State has one of the most active nonprofit sectors in the United States. As of 2013, there were close to 100,000 tax-exempt organizations in New York State. It is evident that development of the nonprofit sector leads to stronger economy. If you look at this chart, in 2012, there were 1.44 million nonprofits that were registered with the Internal Revenue Service of US. The total revenue raised from all registered nonprofit organizations in 2012 was $2.16 trillion. And then, these nonprofit organizations spent $2.03 trillion in economy. Also, they owned $4.84 trillion in assets. Out of all registered nonprofit organizations, approximately 67% are 501c3 public charities, and they accounted for 76% of the total revenues raised by all registered nonprofit organizations and 62% of the total assets owned by nonprofit organizations. Nonprofit organizations have also created various employment opportunities. The number of nonprofit employees grew to 1% of the US labor force in 1900, to 3% in 1960, and 9% in 2000. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2012, the employment in nonprofit organizations was over 11 million, which is equivalent of 10.3% of the total private sector employment in the United States. That's quite a bit. New York State has the highest nonprofit employment, which is 18.1% of the total private sector employment. Closely related to this booming nonprofit sector in the United States are two government entities. One is the Attorney General of each state government, and the other is the Internal Revenue Service of the federal government. Both the Internal Revenue Service and the Attorney General support and regulate the nonprofit organizations and establish and enforce the legal framework of the nonprofit sector. The Internal Revenue Service is a bureau of the Department of the Treasury and is responsible for collecting taxes and the administration of tax code called the Internal Revenue Code. The Attorney General is, in most states, chosen by popular election and is the chief legal advisor to the government and the chief advocate of the public. In New York State, the Attorney General has authority to oversee the solicitation of charitable assets from residents of New York State, including investigating and prosecuting fraudulent charitable solicitations, registering charities that solicit money in the state of New York, and registering and regulating professional fundraisers and fundraising counsel. All charitable organizations that solicit or receive contributions in excess of $25,000 annually are required to register with the Attorney General prior to any solicitation or solicitation of contributions in New York. Professional fundraisers and fundraising counsel that get paid for their work relating to fundraising must also register with the Attorney General prior to entering into any fundraising agreement with a charity for the purpose of raising charitable funds. Attorney General's role as a public advocate is especially important in the nonprofit world because most of the time, the donor does not have a standing or right to make a legal claim against a nonprofit organization for misuse of his or her donation. Donation is a gift. Therefore, courts concluded that donor no longer has standing or right to enforce the terms of the charitable gift. The large legal framework for the nonprofit sector can be explained in two aspects in the US. One is formation, the other one is exemption status. Nonprofit or not-for-profit organizations are groups that are formed not for profit, as the name says, or financial gain, but for the benefit of the public, a specific group of individuals, or the membership of the nonprofit. However, it is never formed for the benefit of its director, officer, staff, or any particular individual. Groups intending to engage in nonprofit activity tend to do so in an organizational structure of either of two, corporation or unincorporated association. It is not required for nonprofit organization to be incorporated. Then what are those two? A corporation is a distinct legal entity which has an existence that is separate and apart from that of the individuals who founded or control the organization or its day-to-day operations. That means a nonprofit corporation continues to exist even if the founders are no longer with the corporation. Because a nonprofit corporation is a legal entity, it is subject to government regulations and benefits. And this is an important fact to remember, and I'll discuss that throughout the conference. Unincorporated association is basically a group of people who come together as an organization to do something. Examples are parent-teacher association, football leagues, or tenants association. So, if a corporation is subject to government regulations, then why would you incorporate a nonprofit organization? That is because incorporation has several advantages. Incorporation provides limited liability for directors, officers, and members. A nonprofit corporation bears responsibility for actions the corporation takes, and in most cases is solely responsible for the debt and liabilities that the corporation incurs. There's no individual or personal liability for directors and officers, with some exceptions. Also, incorporation allows the organization to own property, and that is a huge advantage. Incorporation also facilitates the process of applying for tax exemption status. Also, incorporation may help generate revenues and receive grants. There are a few popular avenues through which nonprofits generate revenues. They include government grants, private foundation grants, and individual and corporate donors. Many government agencies, foundations, and individual and corporate donors are reluctant to provide funds to unincorporated associations. Some even require that the recipient of the funds be incorporated. This is because corporate laws prescribe a set of fairly comprehensive rules governing the activities and structures of the corporation. These rules are set out in the bylaws, which corporations are required to adopt, and these rules enable those associated with the corporation as well as outsiders, for example, funders, banks, suppliers, to determine easily the boundaries of proper corporate action and the proper manner of authorizing such action. And also, incorporation provides for perpetual existence because it is a distinct legal entity. This allows the nonprofit corporation to continue with more stability and long-term plan. If a nonprofit organization is intended for non-perpetual existence or tends to have flexibility or needs to have flexibility in its use of the assets, then unincorporated association may be a better form of nonprofit organization. But there's a caveat. If an unincorporated association wants to solicit funds or hire employees or open a bank account or own property, then it will have to comply with all the legal requirements as a nonprofit corporation. In New York State, not-for-profit corporations are incorporated under and governed by the not-for-profit corporation law, which is based on business corporation law, but with significant differences. What are those differences? Nonprofit corporation cannot have a pecuniary primary purpose or shareholder. Assets of nonprofit corporations are deemed to be owned by the public and not the members or representatives of the nonprofit. Private enrollment is prohibited. Excessive compensation is prohibited. Sale of all or substantially all of the assets of the nonprofit corporation requires court approval. Change in organization's purpose requires court approval. Merger requires court approval. Dissolution requires approval from court and attorney general. And there is a restriction in asset distribution at the time of dissolution of the nonprofit corporation. In New York, incorporation process can be summarized in 4 steps. And I'll be talking about those 4 steps at tomorrow's presentation. The not-for-profit corporation law provides a streamlined, easy incorporation process, making it easy for people to start a new nonprofit corporation. Basically, you can start a nonprofit corporation if you have a non-pecuniary purpose, 3 directors, 1 address, and $120. I'll explain each step tomorrow. Once the nonprofit is incorporated, the following people are involved in the activities of the nonprofit corporation: members, board of directors, officers, and staff. Members of nonprofit corporation play a role similar to shareholders of for-profit corporation. Members are the group of people who have the power to shape the organization in that they elect the board, very important, and they must vote on fundamental corporate decisions such as amending the certificate of incorporation or dissolving the corporation. It is important to consider whether you want members or not. Some groups find a democratic system where members' vote is best. Such a system where members are heavily involved may be the motivation behind starting the group, such as a tenant or association or grassroots or community-based organizations. But members can be burdensome. If a nonprofit decides to have members, it must be remembered that the corporation will have to hold at least 1 annual meeting of the entire membership, and perhaps more frequently if membership votes are required. It is extremely important in drafting the bylaws that the role of the membership remains realistic and practical. Another option is to have what is called nominal members, for example, of a museum. So they receive newsletters, free invitation to events, but they do not have voting power. Board of Directors is the governing body which determines the general policies of the corporation. The Board of Directors oversees the corporation's major internal activities, including hiring and establishing the compensation of the CEO of the nonprofit corporation, and deciding and overseeing budget, fiscal control, and resource allocation. The board of directors oversees the corporation's major external activities, including fundraising. And the board of directors ensures that nonprofit corporation pursues its mission. In a non-membership corporation, the board of directors is vested with all power to make corporate decisions, including selection of their own successors. As you can see, directors have a lot of authority and power within the nonprofit corporation and over the donations received by the corporation. That is why the not-for-profit corporation law makes directors fiduciary and imposes significant duties. As fiduciaries, directors owe duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience to the organization and must subordinate their own interests to that of the organization. I'll discuss all three duties in tomorrow's presentation. Serving on the board of directors of a nonprofit corporation carries with it important responsibilities and obligations. Board structure and board governance are important to maintaining public trust in charitable organization. This director is on a seesaw. In order for him to maintain his balanced position on the seesaw and not fall off of it, he must do his duties listed on the right side while exercising his authority listed on the left side. Since the legal framework of nonprofit sector grants such significant authority and power to the director, it also allows 4 different groups to monitor the director and keep him or her accountable. Those groups are Internal Revenue Service, Attorney General, the donors, and watchdog organizations. These same groups also monitor the nonprofit corporation to ensure that it is operating for proper purposes and is complying with legal obligations. Officers are the individuals who have the responsibility to oversee the day-to-day operations of the corporation and also have the power to bind the corporation. That means they can sign legal papers on behalf of the corporation. They are president or chairperson, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. There's a lot of flexibility in who your officers are and what their responsibilities are. Officers could be selected from the directors, and usually are, or members or staff. The authority of each officer should be clearly established by the board, and it is usually stated in the organization's bylaws. In order to accomplish proper internal control and checks and balances, the not-for-profit corporation law prohibits the same person from serving as both the president and secretary. It also prohibits the CEO from serving as the president. Staff is either volunteers or paid employees responsible for implementing the corporation's programs. It is generally advised that paid staff members do not serve on the board of directors because it can lead to conflict of interest. In addition to formation, nonprofit organizations also have to register with the Attorney General's office if it is soliciting funds, holding property, or conducting an operation. Because, for example, in New York, the Attorney General is responsible for overseeing the administration of charitable assets in the state of New York, representing the interest of charitable beneficiaries and enforcing laws governing the conduct of directors, officers, and trustees of charitable entities. I have briefly covered the formation of nonprofit corporation. Now, I'll talk about nonprofit's exemption status and the involvement of the Internal Revenue Service. This chart is about to show is a simple chart showing a 501c3 public charity as a subset of the nonprofit sector. Nonprofit organization can be either nonprofit corporation or unincorporated association. And And the nonprofit corporation can be either exempt or non-exempt. Unincorporated association can apply for tax exemption, but it has the kind of requirement that it has to follow as a corporation. So under the exempt nonprofit corporation, I showed you only 3 kinds here. Under 501c, and under 501c3, they are either private foundation or public charity. So as you can see, public charity is a subset of the nonprofit organizations. The Internal Revenue Code Section 501c provides the following benefits: exemption from federal income taxation, exemption from federal employment tax, eligibility to receive tax-deductible contributions from other charities, and eligibility for reduced nonprofit mail rate. I'll discuss different kinds of 501c exempt organizations at tomorrow's presentation. For now, I'll focus on 501c3 tax-exempt organizations, in particular 501c3 public charities. What distinguishes a 501c3 public charity from other nonprofit organizations is the purpose of the organization. The purpose of public charity has to be religious, charitable, scientific, testing for public safety, literary, or educational purposes, or to foster national or international amateur sports competition, or for the prevention of cruelty to children or animals. Examples of public charities are environmental organizations, animal welfare charities, cancer awareness organizations, youth mentoring organizations, and educational institutions and churches. As I said before, all 501c3 organizations are divided into 2 main categories: public charities and private foundations. Private foundations are typically funded by one person or one company or a small number of individuals. Examples include the famous Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation. Most private foundations focus on making grants to other organizations. Public charities receive their revenue from a broad spectrum of sources, including individuals, the government, and private foundations. In an application to become a public charity, an organization must state in its application for tax exemption status that it expects in the next 5 years it will receive a diverse source of financial support. The Internal Revenue Service will consider the organization to have met what is called public support test. If it meets either of these tests, one is 1/3 support test, and the other is 10% facts and circumstances test. What are these 2 tests? To meet the 1/3 support test, the organization must show that it expects to receive either or, 1, a substantial part of its support, which is 1/3 at least, through contributions from other public charities, government agencies, and/or the general public. Or it can show that it expects to receive more than 1/3 of its support from contributions, membership fees, and gross receipts from tax-exempt activities, and no more than 1/3 of its support from gross investment income. And I'll tell you why these tests are important. It's very technical, but there is a principle underneath it, which I'll explain shortly. 10% facts and circumstances test. If the organization is unable to show that it will likely satisfy the 1/3 support test, it can still qualify as a public charity if it can show the following. And this is, they have to show all of it. At least 10% of its total support comes from diverse public sources. There is a broad public interest in its programming. It will have an ongoing fundraising program intended to reach a broad cross-section of the public. and its board of directors is representative of a public interest. And examples that can apply to this test is the startup charities with a small base of early donors. What is the most important about these two tests, 1/3 support test and 10% facts and circumstances test, is that a public charity must receive substantial public support from diverse sources. Then what constitutes diverse public source? What constitutes substantial public support? What if an organization has 3 big donors, whether it's a corporate donor or individual donor, who collectively donate, let's say, 35% of total contribution? Does that organization satisfy the 1/3 public support test? Probably not. Under the Internal Revenue Code, to the extent that a single donor contribution exceeds 2% of an organization's total support, it is not considered public support. The 2% limitation also applies to anyone or any entity related to the donor as if made by the donor. That means, for example, a husband and a wife will be treated as a one person for the purpose of the 2% limitation. This 2% limitation helps the organization avoid relying solely on a single large donor who may indirectly influence the organization. When a big donor gives funds to a public charity, what do? You accept it and say thank you. But the public charity will be able to say no to the donor's influence for his private benefit because this 2% limitation rule compels the public charity to continue to seek a diverse public support from a lot of additional donors in order to maintain its public charity status. Then maybe you will consider just being a private foundation rather than a public charity, so that you don't have to make a lot of efforts to do fundraising to large public and worry about satisfying the public support test. But there are significant advantages of being a public charity over a private foundation. Individual donors can deduct cash contributions in full, up to 50% of their adjusted gross income. That means I can give 50% of my income to a public charity and get tax deduction as a donor. I don't have to pay tax on it. Cash donations to public, as opposed to public charity, cash donations to private foundations are only tax deductible up to 30% of adjusted gross income. This means individual donors have a greater tax benefit from making contributions to public charities than the private foundation. In addition, unlike private foundations, public charities have no minimum distribution requirements or additional tax. This is very technical again. Then, is there any disadvantage of being a public charity? Well, practically none, except they have to meet the public support test. To qualify for a 501c3 tax-exempt status, an organization must be organized and operate exclusively for exempt purposes. And private enrollment, private benefit, and excess benefit transactions are prohibited. Basically, that means that there cannot be any transaction that involves private benefit that is outside of the purpose of the organization. Applying for a tax-exempt public charity status is also fairly streamlined, like the incorporation process. You need an application called 1023 or 1023 Easy, charitable purpose, substantial public support, incorporation documents, and $400 or $850. And you can get the tax exemption status. And I'll explain each step at the tax exemption application at tomorrow's session presentation as well. This wonderful benefit of tax-exempt public charity status also comes with important responsibilities and obligations of substantiation and disclosure of charitable contributions, annual financial reporting, and in limited cases, audit. Tax-exempt organizations may be eligible for a number of other state and municipal tax exemptions, such as sales tax exemption, property tax exemption, which can be a substantial amount, and water and sewer charges exemption. However, it is important to note that federal tax exemption organizations do not automatically qualify for these exemptions and must separately apply for them in order to avail themselves of the benefits of such exemption. The Not-for-Profit Corporation Law and the Internal Revenue Code provide the public, including donors, with the right to inspect the nonprofit corporation's documents. They are, for example, certificate of incorporation, which states the purpose of the organization, state registration and report, annual report, and tax exemption application to the Internal Revenue Code, and annual return and financial report to the Internal Revenue Service. The public has access to them. This chart shows the relationship between a charity and Internal Revenue Service that kind of summarizes what we discussed. Charity and Internal Revenue Service have this committed relationship to each other by this statutory status called tax exemption. This tax exemption offers significant benefits listed on the left side, left column, and at the same time requires significant duties listed on the right column. Again, the benefits include exemption from federal income tax and federal employment tax, eligibility to receive state and local tax exemptions, and I think you have to correct the typo there. It's not about receiving tax, but receiving tax exemptions. Eligibility to receive tax-deductible contributions from the public and special mail rate, greater tax deductibility limit, 50%, no annual minimum distribution requirement, and assistance in revenue generation. The duties include, on the right column, pursuing non-pecuniary purpose, operating for the benefit of the public exclusively for tax-exempt purposes, without providing private enrollment, private benefit, or access benefit, submitting and disclosing an annual report, and obtaining substantial public support. It must be emphasized that the purpose of these duties on the right column are not to burden the nonprofit corporation, but to compel transparency and accountability. Carrying out these duties actually helps the nonprofit corporation to operate better. It is not just the benefit of not paying tax, but also the accompanying responsibilities that advances the nonprofit sector. The statute that governs the relationship between a charity and Internal Revenue Service is the Internal Revenue Code, which is the legal infrastructure. Over the years, we've seen the legislative efforts to amend the Internal Revenue Code to provide more refined benefits to the nonprofit sector while keeping them accountable. Monitoring of a charity is done by the reporting and disclosure requirement, which leads to transparency of the nonprofit sector. And the enforcement of the legal infrastructure is done by the Internal Revenue Service, which has the legal authority to do so, which holds the charity accountable. This illustration shows the relationship between the Internal Revenue Service and the nonprofit corporation, where they have this continuous provision of benefits and regulations. Both the benefits and regulations are intended to promote the growth of the nonprofit sector. Next chart shows the relationship between a charity and the state government attorney general. They have also a committed relationship within the framework of incorporation and solicitation of funds. This incorporation and solicitation offers significant benefits, also listed on the left column, and at the same time require significant duties, listed on the right column. Again, the benefits include legal existence that gives your charity the legal right to own and maintain property, limited liability to directors and officers, facilitation of tax-exempt status, revenue generation, concrete internal structure, and perpetual existence. The duties include pursuing non-pecuniary purpose, complying with the duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience, no private enormment, no private benefit, no excess compensation, and also the requirement for registration for solicitation, and approval for significant corporate changes such as amending the corporation's certificate of incorporation or dissolution. Similar to charity's legal relationship with the Internal Revenue Service, the purpose of these duties listed on the right column are not to simply burden the nonprofit, but to compel transparency and accountability. Carrying out these duties actually also help the nonprofit corporation operate better when complied properly. The statute that governs this committee relationship between charity and the Attorney General is a not-for-profit corporation law, which is actually the infrastructure, the legal infrastructure. There are also estates powers and trust law, executive law, Uniform Commercial Code that also relate to nonprofit sector, which I am not discussing at this conference. The monitoring of a charity is done by the registration, reporting, audit, and approval requirement, which leads to transparency of the nonprofit sector. Over the years, we've seen the legislative efforts by the New York State government to lessen the burden of the nonprofit corporation while keeping them accountable. For example, until July 1st, 2014, a charitable organization with gross annual revenue over $250,000 must file an audited financial statement prepared by an independent CPA, which can cost $7,000 to $8,000 minimum to a nonprofit corporation, which can be a lot for a small nonprofit corporation. This $250,000 threshold was increased to $500,000 so that the nonprofit organizations that has gross annual receipt of between $250,000 to $500,000 no longer have to file. In 2021, the audit threshold will be raised to $750,000. And then the enforcement of the legal infrastructure is done by the Attorney General, which holds the charity accountable for the public. Similar illustration shows that the relationship between the Attorney General and nonprofit corporation where there's a continuous provision of benefits and regulations. Both the benefits and regulations are intended to promote the growth of the nonprofit sector. To conclude, I want to emphasize that what drives the nonprofit sector in the United States is all these legal relationships. Fundamentally, a nonprofit organization has a relationship with its beneficiaries and the public at large. It has a relationship with its donors and grantors. It has a relationship with its directors, officers, and staff. It builds a relationship with other nonprofit organizations and watchdog organizations. It also builds a relationship with its community and particular industry. Finally, it has a relationship with the government, in particular, the Internal Revenue Service and the Attorney General. When all these legal relationships are in harmony with one another, nonprofit jobs are created, national economy becomes stronger, and particular industries like music, art, social welfare, education, law, medicine, relief work, science, technology, and literacy advances. And the legal framework that I explained today is the foundation where all these relationships are able to work together to help the nonprofit sector flourish for the benefit of the public. I look forward to delving into the legal framework of nonprofit sector more in detail at tomorrow's presentation. Thank you very much.